I also do think it is really harmful when we have a situation where a lot of people who really want therapy and need therapy are afraid of getting therapy because of this ideological capture on issues including gender ideology. It could be other things as well. I've heard a lot of criticisms about the the profession of therapy in that regard, but it is extraordinarily dangerous to have a situation where a medical professional field is political in this way. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending in March 14th, 2025. First, a summary of the news. Canadian nurse Amy Hamm found guilty of some charges of professional misconduct due to gender-critical statements. San Francisco's Archimedes Banya bathhouse bows to trans activist pressure. A trans-identified baby killer in Indiana demands access to medical transition in prison. Detransitioners meet with the U.S. Department of Education to commemorate Detrans Awareness Day. A female college student wins a Title IX case involving a trans-identified male in the restroom, and the Supreme Court agrees to hear a case involving a conversion therapy ban. We'll begin with the news from Canada and a rather unfortunate update on the Amy Hamm saga. For those of you who don't know, Amy Hamm is a nurse in Canada who is under investigation by the British Columbia College of Nurses and Midwives for making gender-critical statements in various articles and on social media. The Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms, which offered legal counsel to Hamm, has some background on the case. According to the center, one thing Hamm did was co-sponsor a billboard in September of 2024 that said, "I heart J.K. Rowling," which was taken down by its sponsors after only 30 hours due to vandalism and criticism. Hamm also spoke out against men and women's prisons, crisis centers, changing rooms, and sports. She was reported to the British Columbia College of Nurses and Midwives by a self-proclaimed social justice advocate and had to endure 20 days of disciplinary hearings starting in September of 2022 and ending in March of 2024. More recently, on March 13th, the Justice Center had reported that the disciplinary panel of the British Columbia College of Nurses had concluded that Hamm is indeed guilty of professional misconduct for 4 particular items she wrote or podcasted about. When it was mentioned that she was a nurse in the attached biography, she was cleared about her comments on social media because she did not identify as a nurse in her bio in those cases. Hamm's lawyer, Lisa Bildy, clarified the ruling by saying that Hamm was only found guilty when her professional status as a nurse was brought into the conversation, because then the College of Nurses and Midwives felt like they had the authority to regulate what she had to say. Bildy also hinted on X that there might be some possibility of appealing, though nothing for sure has been announced yet. It's disappointing this happened because defining male and female is a matter of biological reality that should not be controversial as a nurse or any medical professional that is, by definition, dealing with biological reality. It's also disappointing on free speech grounds, as it gives professional associations in Canada a huge amount of leeway to regulate their members' statements. Granted, it could be worse. At least the ruling didn't tell Hamm what she couldn't say outside the nursing field by something as seemingly as arbitrary as using or not using the word nurse in a biographical blurb. But still, why should it be wrong for someone to say, as a nurse, that males and females are different based on biology? This seems to be a policy that puts politics above science, a sort of ideological creep into the medical profession, which transgender activists had been so successful at doing. As Amy Hamm herself pointed out on X, quote, "And as the guilty verdict ran out, men around the globe continued to be male," end quote. Now turning to California. Last week, we reported on the controversy about the Archimedes Banya, a Russian nude bathhouse in San Francisco, which was criticized by trans rights advocates for having a monthly women's only day for biological females only. Well, the San Francisco Chronicle reported on March 12th that the Archimedes Banya is now allowing trans identified males into their women's only night, provided that they cover their genitals. This came after the bathhouse was hit by a deluge of protests and negative Yelp reviews. And the plot thickens as Redux is now reporting that one of the trans activists that protested Archimedes Banya is a registered sex offender. According to a Redux article by Genevieve Gluck on March 12th, Dwight Aston, who started calling himself Dakota Rose Austin in 2022, is registered in California as a level 4 sex offender, making him a moderate to high risk for reoffending. His crime was rape by force or fear. Well, this is particularly significant given that the justification Archimedes Banya gave for its female-only night was, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, was to, quote, accommodate women who, by their beliefs, culture, or other reasons, including a history of sexual assault, were uncomfortable with exposed male genitalia, unquote. I think it's pretty outrageous that we are in a cultural zeitgeist where a bathhouse feels pressured into siding with sexual predators over sexual assault victims. But here we are. And with that, what have you got for us, Sylvia?
Thank you, Arianne. This past week was Detrans Awareness Day on March 12th, a day to recognize and raise awareness for those who underwent medical transition and have now ceased the process. It is a day marked by education on what detransition is, spreading awareness that it exists, and advocating for alternatives to the affirmation-only model for treating gender dysphoria. The day was founded in 2021 and has been gaining traction with each new year. This year's Detrans Awareness Day was particularly successful after a group of detransitioners spoke with officials from the Department of Education, the Secretary of Education, and a representative from the Department of Health and Human Services. The meeting was initiated by GenSpect, an organization dedicated to, quote, promoting a healthy approach to sex and gender. While we at LGB Alliance mark this meeting as a progressive step forward, many view this meeting as antithetical to trans rights. LGBTQ Nation's very biased report stated that the meeting sought to, quote, push the Trump administration's false narrative that there are only two immutable sexes, male and female, and that GenSpect spews, quote, anti-trans propaganda. It seems there is still much work that needs to be done to destigmatize those who speak out on the harms of gender-affirming care. Next, Jonathan Richardson, now going by the name Autumn Cordileone, is serving a 55-year sentence for murdering his 11-month-old stepdaughter. The autopsy found that the baby had died of asphyxiation by manual strangulation, and Richardson later told a prison official, quote, all I know is I killed the little fucking bitch. The ACLU has taken it upon itself to advocate for Richardson's right to medically transition and be housed in a female prison. They assert that the House Bill 1569 is, quote, cruel and unusual punishment because it bans the spending of state dollars on sexual reassignment surgery for inmates. Dr. Kelsey Beers, a psychiatrist hired by the IDOC, Indiana Department of Correction, concluded that Richardson was not suffering from gender dysphoria, but instead had an attention-seeking personality disorder. The ACLU disputed this, claiming that this psychiatrist was not properly trained on gender identity, and on March 5th, Judge Richard Young stated that Richardson, quote, has demonstrated that she is suffering irreparable harm and will continue to suffer such harm unless she is provided gender-affirming surgery. At which point, he then renewed the injunction demanding that the IDOC seek to arrange Richardson's surgery at the earliest possible opportunity. So, Congratulations, citizens of Indiana. Your tax dollars are set to pay for this psychopath surgery and pain-relieving drugs. Jos?
Thanks, Sylvia. Today I'm starting with a win for Payton McNabb in a Title IX case against her. You may recall that Payton suffered a traumatic brain injury during a girls' volleyball game against a team with a male player who spiked the ball at her head. McNabb, in this case, encountered a trans-identifying male in the women's restroom at Western Carolina University, WCU, and began recording the incident because she feared for her safety. She wanted to document the incident, document her discomfort, and to prove that she was neither rude nor offensive. In this Title IX case, WCU ruled that McNabb did not sexually harass the male. As the Independent Women's Forum states, the ruling affirms Payton's position that she can protect herself in a reasonable way since the individual is, in fact, male. About the case, Payton states, quote, "Women must stand up, speak out, and listen to their intuition. Gender ideology was effectively struck down in my Title IX case. Once again, showing that truth wins." End quote. Moving now to information about a new case before the Supreme Court. On Monday, the Supreme Court decided to hear the case Childs versus Salazar, which many in the media have referred to as a challenge to the state's conversion therapy ban. At the heart of this case is a licensed counselor, Kaylee Childs, who is also a Christian and says her clients sometimes want to discuss issues that, quote, implicate Christian values about human sexuality and the treatment of their own body, end quote. Childs and her legal team, Alliance Defending Freedom, contend that the law violates her First Amendment rights to free speech and to freely exercise her religion. The Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit rebuffed Childs' challenge by reasoning the law regulates therapists' conduct rather than their speech. Alliance Defending Freedom notes that, quote, the law only prohibits counseling conversations in one direction. For example, it allows counseling conversations that aim to steer young people toward a gender identity different than their sex, but prohibits conversations that aim to help them return to comfort with their sex when they desire that. The law threatens severe penalties, including suspension and even revocation of the counselor's license. This one-sided censorship comes amidst a growing national health crisis and prevents many Colorado children from obtaining the counseling that they desire, and that science says is likely to help, end quote. We know from studies conducted in 1986, 2008, and 2012 that upwards of 90% of children who struggle with gender identity issues in adolescence will desist after puberty. Anecdotally, I know or know of a number of such cases. In fact, I just got a DM the other day from another formerly trans-identified young woman who detransitioned after being on testosterone for 2 years. We also know it's nearly impossible to find a therapist who isn't mandated to affirm a child's gender identity, even in states like Florida. So does it make sense then to provide children in distress affirmation-only therapy when desistance rates are so high? And here's where things get tricky around so-called conversion therapy bans. First of all, do you know who cared about gay conversion therapy prior to 2013? Well, gay people cared. I knew gay people who endured conversion therapy at Exodus International's headquarters in Orlando, and what they endured was untenable. But no legislative body took any action on conversion therapy bans until the fall of 2013, when California and New Jersey became the first 2 states to ban conversion therapy of a person's sexual orientation. When they did so, the earliest versions of their bills read that, quote unquote, sexual orientation change efforts, which is what they were banning, was defined around sexual orientation and did not initially mention gender identity. Oregon followed almost 2 years later in May of 2015, but this time conversion therapy was cited as a practice that tries to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. As you'll recall, major LGBTQ NGOs like HRC started pivoting their advocacy work to not just include but prioritize transgender and queer advocacy in late 2014 on the precipice of gay marriage. Gay marriage was ultimately legalized on June 26, 2015, after the US Supreme Court struck down all bans on same-sex marriage and required states to honor out-of-state same-sex marriage licenses in the case Obergefell versus Hodges. All in all, 28 states and 2 US territories have conversion therapy bans in place. What seems to have happened after reading through original versions and amended versions of the earliest bills around conversion therapy was a shift in language. A language shift came not just from groups like HRC, GLAAD, and NCLR, but professional organizations like the American Psychoanalytic Association and the American School Counselor Association, which I suspect were heavily nudged by LGBTQ NGOs. In fact, NCLR had a campaign around banning conversion therapy called Born Perfect. The goal of the Born Perfect campaign, which launched in 2014, was to ban conversion therapy in all 50 states by 2019. As an aside, there's something profoundly flawed with a campaign called Born Perfect that leans into trans identity. For LGB people who suffered truly cruel conversion therapy practices, the campaign makes sense. But when applied to an ideology that demands a quote-unquote born perfect person change everything about themselves to adopt a different gender reality, the campaign is just inane. Further, it's insulting to people who endured actual conversion therapy. And so this is the conundrum organizations like ours find ourselves in, because we obviously oppose conversion therapy of same-sex oriented people. Unfortunately, the forced teaming of LGB with TQIA, along with a lack of understanding about homosexuality versus gender identity, led legislators to adopt language that was, in one way or another, dictated by LGBTQ NGOs. So legislation that could have been productive was distorted into something that ultimately works against same-sex oriented people. As an example, we just published an interview for Detrans Awareness Day with Levi Hayes, who is a gay detransitioner. In the interview, he spoke to how affirmation-only practices helped to guide him on a pathway to transition in just 2 sessions with his therapist. And Levi's story isn't a one-off. At LGB Alliance USA, we've heard from so many LGBT transitioners that when they sought therapy as an effeminate man or a masculine woman, that the default seemed to be affirmation of a gender identity, and the diagnosis was given in record time. The LGBT community is disproportionately affected by affirmation-only therapy, so when gender identity is tied to gay conversion therapy bans, it all but renders the legislation moot in terms of actually banning gay conversion therapy of gay people. Instead, LGBTQ plus orgs ended up enshrining gay conversion therapy practices into law when they pushed to add gender identity onto that legislation. I reached out to Rich Guggenheim, who runs Gays Against Groomers Colorado chapter, for a comment. Rich said, quote, "We call on the Supreme Court to recognize the fundamental rights at stake in this case and to uphold the principles of free speech and religious liberty for all Americans. Gays Against Groomers remains committed to advocating for individual autonomy and the right to seek care aligned with one's values, free from government overreach," end quote. So it will be interesting to hear the arguments around this case in October of 2025 and to see what SCOTUS decides by the spring of 2026. And I'm curious to hear what you two think.
So this is a tricky one for me in terms of the legal issues at play here, because on one hand, I have to admit that defenders of this conversion therapy ban are technically right, I think, about the issues with saying this is a free speech case. Because it is true that therapists, that they can't, as therapists, when they're giving advice to clients, when they're trying to help clients, they can't just say anything. Like they actually have to make sure that what their treatments, what they're saying is in accord with standards of care. At least that's my understanding. Like you could run afoul professional misconduct if you recommend something that's like considered a really dangerous pseudoscience or something as a therapist. I'm not talking about like what you say, privately. However, I think what might be a stronger argument is something that we've gone back to a lot, which is that you could make the case that this anti-conversion therapy ban in effect is an endorsement of gender ideology. And that by doing that, by in effect saying that you could have like a gender different from your biological sex, that's a religious view, and hence this law is unconstitutional because it's enforcing a particular religious belief. if I were to split hairs on legal things based on, I'm an amateur, not a legal expert, but if I were to split hairs, that would be the avenue that I think would be more compelling than the free speech avenue.
That's really thought-provoking, Arianne. I hadn't ever framed it that way, but I think you're dead right that, it's kind of forcing everyone to agree that gender identity exists. Perhaps in a similar or maybe dissimilar vein, that gay rights advocates were saying being same-sex attracted is not a disorder, that it's not something that needs to be cured. But I do think about, there's gay people or supposedly ex-gay people that say they took themselves to a conversion therapist and now they're cured or whatever. I've seen those people speak, and while I'm not entirely convinced that they are cured of their homosexuality, or if perhaps they're just bisexual and they're able to suppress or whatever the case may be, they advocate saying we shouldn't stop therapists from trying to help people who suffer from same-sex attraction. I think that the argument that would be against your argument, Arianne, is that saying, well, if you're saying that gender identity is not innate, then couldn't you say that being gay is not innate? And my answer to that is no, because they're two completely different things. I think that the problem arises when we medicalize or pathologize gender nonconformity. So to say I experience same-sex attraction, that is not a disorder, is not the same thing as I'm a man, but I behave this way, or I'm a woman and I behave this way. And that means that I have a gender identity incongruence and I am therefore trans or non-binary or whatever. And I think forcing psychologists or therapists to accept that people have a gendered soul is where the problem lies. So thank you, Arianne, for articulating that. I hope what I said made sense.
No, I think that was very well said, and I agree. And I do think it is a tricky issue, when you're presenting your arguments in front of the Supreme Court, to make sure that you make a distinction, like how do you articulate that distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity? Because that is when you just frame it as gender identity is innate and sexual orientation is innate, it is easy for someone who isn't really carefully thinking about the topic to just accept that. But really, they are, as you've explained, they are different. And sexual orientation, it's kind of just like a statement of being, like you have a particular sex and you're attracted to particular sexes.
And your attraction can actually be measured. In men's cases, literally measured. But in with like you can actually see when a person is attracted to someone of the same sex or opposite sex, which is why in gay conversion therapy, they would do, I don't remember the name, where they would shock gay men if they got aroused by seeing gay images. Because the thought was if you see an image of two men and you're turned on and we shock you, that will train your brain, right? That's because sexual orientation is actually measurable, but gender identity, I think, is 100% subjective. And again, is just pathologizing gender nonconformity. Sorry to cut you off, Arianne.
No, thank you for clarifying. That's a good point. And I'd also add to that you can make the argument that sexual orientation is in some sense comparable to gender expression / gender dysphoria, that it is the case that there are some people that are uncomfortable presenting their clothes or their behavior in a way that accords to the stereotypes of their sex. And that indeed may very well be innate and very hard, to fix, quote unquote. And so we can say, okay, that we shouldn't try to convince girls who are uncomfortable wearing a dress that yes, actually you should be comfortable wearing a dress. That would be comparable to trying to change someone's sexual orientation. But the actual identity on top of that, and even worse, the medicalization of it, is a completely separate issue.
I appreciate the argument that Alliance Defending Freedom is coming from, that the conversation only goes one way in this, in the sense that it has to be affirmation only. There is no option to say you could, to give therapy that would lean back in the other direction. I don't want to compare the baby killer, but he's attention seeking. And I feel like a lot of times, especially with this phenomenon and seeing so many youth, of course, it's everywhere around them, but there's so much of a social contagion around the notion of having a gender identity, adopting a gender identity, wearing a flag, having all these crazy sexualities at 10 years old, like those sorts of things. Parents are seeking care for their kids. And when they go and look for a therapist, even in states like Florida, in states where you would think they would be able to find a therapist that would be right the middle somewhere, at least be neutral, that's just not the case. It's affirmation only or extreme religion, and it's like there's no middle ground. So it's the one-way conversation is not all right, because it is kind of it is mandating a personal religious belief, because it does this social contagion of gender feels like a religion. I think you put that really well, Arianne, that is definitely leaning into one side of a very religious or belief-based system.
Ultimately, I think it's too bad that this is being decided at a legal level, because ultimately I'm very critical of professional medical associations for endorsing what I think is just bad medicine and bad treatment. That's ideally, they are the ones that should be getting this right, and having a situation where now politicians and judges have to adjudicate what is considered appropriate medical care or appropriate psychological care is not an ideal situation to be in. But here we are.
And the reality is too that the amount of pressure, like what is it, put the thumb on the scale, that came from powerful, and they were less powerful at the time, LGBTQ NGOs, to weigh on like the APA, all these different medical bodies that are coming out with pseudoscience type statements that they're leaning into legislative bodies. So the legislative body doesn't know anything. It's a bunch of heterosexuals. They don't know anything about homosexuality. They don't know anything about gender identity, but they know that they're getting pressure and they need to do something about it. So we start to see bills and laws around this, but the input they're getting, the only people with a seat at the table are LGBTQ NGOs, which have force teamed us and are advancing a messaging that is harmful to us. So it becomes really difficult to have any kind of governance when there's so much misinformation and uneducated people around the issues that affect what we are, a very niche minority of same-sex oriented people. But then the governance is also really skewed through this gender identity lens. So it just feels like a catastrophe to me, honestly. Like there's no winning for gay people in this, and it's a really hard argument to talk about. It's a really hard issue to discuss because of the implications for us as same-sex oriented people wanting to have just parity in the law and to be left alone and not to be converted. But if we go to seek therapy and then we're converted, de facto converted, but going and struggling with gender incongruity, whatever, gender neutrality. Like I've always been very, like we used to call it androgynous. Like it wasn't a big deal. Like, but if I went to a therapist and I said I'm same-sex oriented and I am uncomfortable wearing dresses and I don't like that to present very feminine, and I was told that well, maybe I have a gender identity that's this or that or the other, it's very harmful to gay people. So it's just no winning. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the courts. I'm really curious what Glenna Goldis thinks about this, because she's talked about how these cases are argued before the Supreme Court. So I'm curious what her thoughts are on this in particular.
I agree, and I also do think it is really harmful when we have a situation where a lot of people who really want therapy and need therapy are afraid of getting therapy because of this ideological capture on issues including gender ideology. It could be other things as well. I've heard a lot of criticisms about the profession of therapy in that regard, but it is extraordinarily dangerous to have a situation where a medical professional field is political in this way. And with that, thank you everyone for watching. We hope to see you again next week. Happy Pi Day!